Hi, and welcome to today's class on the circulatory system. If you would like to get more information on the circulatory system, there's a few pages that you can read in your textbook, pages 915 to 922. We'll also cover some of the same basic information on the circulatory system that I cover today. It's important to realize, though, that whether you watch a crash course video or read the textbook, that it may go into more or less detail on the circulatory system than I would expect you to know, or that I will go into. I'm uh, very specifically streamlining, or I guess being very specific about the content on the circulatory system that I think you should know. And so you may get more or less detail online or on the textbook. By way of very general overview of the circulatory system, let's talk about its basic or essential function, or functions, plural, actually. There's several functions for the circulatory system. And by the way, when we talk about the circulatory system, we're essentially talking about the heart, and all of the blood vessels that lead into and out of the heart. So that includes the arterioles and capillaries, veins, and arteries. All of those are essentially an internal network of tubes that, together with the heart, form a closed system that we call the circulatory system. Circulatory systems do vary a little bit between different organisms. Now, we've talked about diversity in invertebrates as well as vertebrates. Invertebrates have different circulatory systems than we do, and there's even some different kinds of vertebrate circulatory systems, but they all serve basically the same functions. Our bodies, regardless of what organism we're talking about, need to receive nutrients from the digestive system. We just talked about the digestive system, and it's important that we have a whole system of blood vessels that feed and wrap and integrate with the digestive system so that all of those nutrients that we absorbed can move into the bloodstream and then be circulated around the body and distributed to the different cells, because every cell in our body requires nutrients such as glucose in order to function. We also need a system that will move respiratory gases. So this includes, obviously, carbon dioxide and oxygen. We typically breathe in high levels of oxygen, which diffuse into our blood. The blood circulates those oxygen molecules around the body. And as it does so, it exchanges it for carbon dioxide, which you may remember is a waste product from cellular metabolism. So every cell in our body, except our red blood cells, well, possibly even our red blood cells, have mitochondria, which perform cellular metabolism, and to do that they require oxygen, glucose, and then convert that into ATP and carbon dioxide as a waste product, which then has to be circulated through the blood and into the lungs, and then we can exhale it. And then last but not least, we need to excrete any wastes. We'll talk in a little bit about one of the products of cellular metabolism of proteins is nitrogenous waste, which needs to be essentially circulated through the body and then excreted. So our circulatory systems then perform a variety of functions, including the absorption, or they receive nutrients, the circulating the nutrients around the body, circulating gases, and picking up waste and transporting them to the kidneys, where they can be excreted through our urine. As a result, our circulatory system works very, very closely with three other organ systems, in particular, the digestive system, as well as the lungs, where gas exchange occurs, and the kidneys, where nitrogenous waste is excreted. And again, just to be clear, when we talk about the circulatory system, we're basically talking about the heart, which serves as a pump, and the pump forces blood through the narrow tubes, again, to deliver oxygen and nutrients and collect waste such as CO2 and nitrogen and excrete them out of the body. Um, Something that may not be immediately obvious to us is that our blood vessels form what's called a closed system of circulation. In other words, all of the blood vessels in our body uh, form one complete network. And the blood should always stay in the blood vessels. So that means, for example, if our hearts were to pump blood, or if our heart was to pump blood away from the heart, the first place that it goes is a very, very large blood vessel called the aorta. So oxygenated blood essentially gets squeezed out of our heart through the left ventricle. It then exits through the aorta, which is an enormous blood vessel, but then immediately the aorta begins to branch. And so blood comes out of the aorta and then will divert through some of those branches. And those then become smaller blood vessels, smaller arteries. And then those arteries in turn will branch again and again. And they will get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so all of these blood vessels then branch extensively in an effort to reach all of the cells in the human body. Now, eventually, as blood gets through the very, very narrowest of these blood vessels called capillaries, and again, they're doing their job, they're picking up carbon dioxide and delivering oxygen and delivering nutrients and picking up waste. But eventually, these very, very narrow blood vessels actually start to get a little bit larger, and they start to join with other narrow blood vessels. And at this point, they're now called veins. They're actually now returning blood back to the heart. But the veins then sort of collect together like tributaries of a river. Lots of smaller streams eventually join to form larger streams. And eventually they form very, very large blood vessels. So there's really extensive branching of blood vessels that extend throughout the entire body. And they're either getting smaller and smaller and smaller and diverting blood into more and more pathways, or they're starting to collect blood through very small blood vessels and return it back to the heart. But this again is called a closed circulatory system, and blood should really never, ever leave our closed circulatory systems. If they do, for example, we might have something like internal bleeding or bruises where we break and rupture the blood vessels, and those things have to heal. And again, to recap, this last slide was kind of, I thought, pretty cool because these are scanning electron microscope images where you can see what looks like arteries branching into smaller and smaller arteries. These in turn branch smaller and smaller and smaller. And what you can actually see is that these are completely wrapped around the small intestine. So you can see the extensive branching that occurs. And again, this is either it's hard to tell from the scanning electron microscope if these are arteries that are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, or in fact, if they're veins which are sort of collecting together. But either way, you can see that there's extensive branching that occurs in the circulatory system. A quick note about this then. So this is a very big overview of the circulatory system. We have our heart. We have essentially networks of blood vessels. So let's again follow blood coming out of the aorta. This is really not accurate, but blood does come out of the aorta here. And it essentially branches and branches and branches and branches and feeds the body, delivering oxygen and picking up waste. And eventually then these smaller vessels start to collect together and again bring blood back to the heart. What's actually being shown here are the two, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but these are the two basic pathways of blood. They're either going to and from the lungs or to and from the body. But in any event, blood that travels away from the heart is defined as an artery. So any of these blood vessels, right, the aorta being the largest artery, any of the blood vessels, though, that continue to branch, deliver blood, and take it away from the heart are called arteries. But if the blood then is on its pathway back to the heart, these, whatever size blood vessels they are all collectively defined as veins. And so that's an important distinction. Arteries go away from and veins go toward the heart. And then the capillaries, where it may be hard to know whether or not they're going to or from the heart at that point because they're so small, we just collectively call those capillaries. They're very, very, the smallest branches of the circulatory system. So let's focus a little bit on the human cardiovascular system and the heart. I alluded to this a minute ago, but again, our heart basically pumps blood in one of two places. It either pumps blood to the lungs in order to get rid of carbon dioxide it's collected from the body and pick up oxygen and then bring it back to the heart, or it's now pumping oxygenated blood around the body and collecting carbon dioxide and returning deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So essentially there's two circuits, right? If this is our heart here, and blood is being pumped out of the heart to the lungs and then from the lungs back, that forms one complete circuit called the pulmonary circuit. And in one of our next classes, we'll talk about the pulmonary system. But essentially, blood is going out of the heart toward the lungs. Again, it's picking up oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide and then returning back to the heart, now fully oxygenated. That complete circuit out of the heart to the lungs and back is called the pulmonary circuit. Now, oxygenated blood at this point needs to be delivered to the body. And this then is going to pump blood out of the body, either up towards the head and the brain and the upper appendages, your arms and hands, or it's going to go down to the lower body. But in any event, this is now called the systemic circuit. It's now delivering blood to the entire body, where it's, again, going to deliver its oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. So again, we have basically two circuits, and the heart is actually divided into halves. One which is collecting deoxygenated blood and pumping it to the heart. That's the pulmonary circuit and back. And then the other part of the heart is essentially it's collecting the oxygenated blood and delivering it to the body. That's now called the systemic circuit. But basically your heart's really just doing this, to the lungs and back, to the body and back. Lungs and back, body and back. It's not really kind of divided like I'm showing with my fingers, but I'm just trying to indicate that there's two basic pathways, the pulmonary circuit and then the systemic circuit. So let's take a look at the heart itself. And what we've done here is sort of cut the heart, it's sort of longitudinally, a big cut down through the heart. And we're now exposing the four chambers of the heart. I think probably most of you know at this point that the heart has four chambers. It has two small chambers at the top of the heart, called the atria, or an atrium singular. So there's two atria. And then below each of the atria, we have two larger chambers called the ventricles. Now there's a reason why the chambers aren't equal size. And the reason is this. Blood will enter the atria, and then regardless of whether it's coming from the body or coming from the lungs, either way, the atria basically receive blood. And then blood always goes from an atrium to a ventricle. And as a result, the atria really only have to push blood, a few inches below. Right? You can see that blood doesn't have to go very far from an atrium to a ventricle. But the ventricles have to push blood much further. Our right ventricles will push blood out of the heart, and then it immediately splits and either goes to the left or to the right lungs. And as a result, the ventricle, because it has to exert a greater force to push blood all the way through the lungs and back again, because by the way, the force generated from the heart continues to push blood not only through the smaller capillaries of the lungs, but it also has to continue to exert enough force to continue to push it back through the smaller capillaries and back into the veins, returning to the heart. So that it's exerting a lot of force to push blood a much greater distance. And then, of course, the left ventricle has very, very thick walls because it has to exert the greatest force of all. It actually has to squeeze blood out of the heart. And then here's that atrium I talked about a few minutes ago, all the way out of the atrium and then to the entire body. So we actually have a disproportionate sized series of chambers or rooms. We don't have four nice equal sized rooms. We have two smaller atria because they just push blood into the ventricles, and then the ventricles expand and either push blood to the lungs or they push blood to the entire body. And so here's a quick summary then. Atria are chambers where blood first enters the heart, and then they squeeze blood from the atria down into the ventricles below them. So the ventricles are much thicker, more powerfully muscled chambers. And then, well, actually, we'll talk about the valves in a second, but it's important to realize all of these references here on this diagram where they talk about right and left may seem backwards to us, right? So we're looking at this diagram and we can see the direction here that says right lung and left lung, which to me, at least on this diagram, this is the right and this is the left. But it's important to realize, and this is actually really important for labeling purposes, when biologists or cardiologists talk about the chambers of the heart and whether they're on the left or right, they're not talking about them based on how we're looking at them in the body of the person. We're actually talking about the chambers as if we're looking at the heart in the patient themselves or in the individual. So if I'm looking down and I see right my right and left, sorry, my right atria and my right ventricles, when you're looking at it, this is your left, but it's my right. So the labeling is based on the viewpoint of the person, not of the observer, if that makes sense. So this then, let's see, chamber number 1 right here would actually, it's on the left-hand side of this diagram, but this is the right atrium and the right ventricle below it. And then here's number 2, the left atrium and the left ventricle. All right, last but not least on this diagram, there are things called valves. And there are valves, there are actually 4 valves in the heart. And the function of the valves is to prevent backflow of blood. So they're kind of like doors that open up, say in a movie theater, to allow people out, and then they close behind to prevent people from coming back in and watching a couple more movies. That's a bad metaphor, I guess. But what happens then if blood is being pushed, in my case, below here from the bottom into another chamber above, the force of the blood moving from one chamber to the next will actually force the valves open. But then the valves, they're actually kind of tapered and point towards the chamber where blood is flowing. So in this case, blood will push from the bottom into the chamber above. They'll actually open up, they'll allow blood flow, and then as soon as the chamber below has squeezed all the blood out, those valves snap back closed again. And that prevents blood from backflowing rather into the chamber from which it once came. And it's an efficiency thing. We wouldn't want blood to be pushed out and then wash back in. It just would be very ineffective. So these valves then are really important to prevent blood from filling back into the chamber from whence they came. They open up, they snap back closed, and they actually make an audible sort of thump when they snap back closed. And this is one of the things that a cardiologist or your family doctor would listen for with a stethoscope. They hear lub dub, lub dub. That's the sound of the chamber of the valves closing once the blood has flowed out of them and it closes behind. There's 2 basic kinds. There's names for each of these valves, but essentially all I care about is that you know that there are 2 basic sets of valves. 2 that prevent blood from flowing back into the atria. These are called atrioventricular valves. So blood then in the right atrium will be squeezed from that atrium into the ventricle below it, and the atrial ventricular valve on the right-hand side would snap closed. At the same time, blood is flowing from the lungs into the left atrium and then down into the left ventricle. This will prevent, as this one closes, this atrial ventricular valve prevents the backflow of blood from the left ventricle to the left atrium. There are then, it's a little hard to see in this diagram, but there's another valve behind the ventricles. Once they push their blood out, these valves close behind them. They're called semi-lunar valves because they look like a half moon. But you can see, if you look at the arrow here of the blood coming out of the right ventricle, here's our semi-lunar valve. Blood flows out actually into something called the pulmonary arteries. And as soon as the blood is all squeezed out of the ventricle, the semi-lunar valves close. So again, a lub dub you hear are the sound of the atrial ventricular valves closing, and then a fraction of a second later, once the blood is then emptied out of the ventricles, the semi-lunar valves close behind Here's another diagram of the heart, again showing the same thing. Here you can see the valves are pointing in the direction of blood flow. So in this case, we have blood flowing in from, these are called the vena cava. We'll talk about them in one of the next slides. But then blood flows into the right atrium, to the right ventricle, out to the lungs and back. That's our pulmonary circuit. Then blood returns from the lungs into the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, out of the aorta into the entire body, and now it's going to complete our systemic circuit. So the next two slides, one of them has all the text version of the circulation of the pathway of blood through the body, and I would like you to know this basic pathway. And it's all numbered here. The numbers on this slide correspond to the numbers on this slide. But essentially, and because this is a circuit or a loop, we could theoretically start anywhere. But let's again start with deoxygenated blood returning to the heart. So at this point, we're now going to follow the pathway of blood, whether it's coming from the upper body through its series of veins back to the heart, or from the lower body and its veins back to the heart. But in either case, we're talking about deoxygenated blood. Now, a quick note, blood isn't really ever blue, at least not the way they show it in textbooks, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. But by convention, most textbooks will show what is supposed to be deoxygenated blood in blue and oxygenated blood in red. So that's why there's two different colors. And then, of course, the purple here is where oxygen and carbon dioxide are being exchanged. So in this case, we can see in our lungs that the deoxygenated blue blood is exchanging its carbon dioxide for oxygen and become oxygenated and turning red. But remember, of course, it doesn't really do that in the body. So here we go. Deoxygenated blood is coming from the upper part of the body and the lower part of the body. And both of these large veins, by the time they return back to the body, or back to the heart rather, they're fairly large. And they're called the vena cava, which basically means big vein. But we have what's called the inferior vena cava because it's coming from the lower part of the body, and the superior vena cava because it's coming from the top of the body. Now, the two vena cava then dump their blood into the right atrium. Right atrium fills up and squeezes it into the right ventricle. So I started with number 9 and 10, but instead of number 1 and 2. But basically, right, if we follow the deoxygenated blood in the right ventricle, well, it came from the right atrium above it, which came from the veins that collected the blood from the body, upper and lower, inferior and superior. And so now we have deoxygenated blood in the right ventricle. The blood is then squeezed out. You can see those semilunar valves opening up. The blood flows out and actually splits right above the heart in pulmonary arteries. In this case, again, pulmonary means lungs. So we have a pulmonary artery which diverts blood to the lungs where it can exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen. The blood then continues through the smaller capillaries of the lungs, exchanging gases, and then it returns back to the heart through pulmonary veins. We have now completed the pulmonary circuit. You can see on the left and right-hand side here, both of these lungs are doing the gas exchange, or the blood is flowing through them and gas exchange is occurring. And so we have two pulmonary veins which return back to the heart, and then they dump their blood into the left atrium, number 5. From the left atrium, blood goes immediately below it because blood from atria always goes into ventricles. You can see the atrioventricular valve opens up, blood dumps into the left ventricle. Blood then leaves the left ventricle with extremely high force. The highest blood pressure of the body is right out of the left ventricle through the aorta. And the aorta, it's hard to see in this diagram, it's not really accurate, but it basically, well, it's kind of accurate. It basically comes up and splits. There's a whole bunch of splits right out of the aorta immediately that divert blood and arteries to the upper part of the body. And that's what this sort of split is showing you. But there's actually several blood vessels that immediately leave the aorta for the upper part of the body, the arms and the head. And then the aorta takes actually a big swoop down in behind the heart, dives down behind the lower part of the body, runs all the way along deep in the body above the spine, all the way down the length of the body Again, lots of splits are happening here. They don't really show on this diagram. They just show the splits as happening down here. But then oxygenated blood then is circulated either to the lower extremities or the upper extremities. Again, gas exchange happens, and then the whole circuit continues. The smaller capillaries feed into the veins. The superior vena cava dumps blood back into the right atrium. Down here, we have our smaller arteries that have to branch into capillaries and delivered oxygen, picked up carbon dioxide. They now collect together and form the inferior vena cava and back into the right atrium, and the whole process starts again. So again, very quickly, deoxygenated blood goes from right atrium to right ventricle, out through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Gas exchange happens, so we now have oxygenated blood. The blood returns through pulmonary veins back into the left atrium, from the left atrium to the left ventricle, from the left ventricle out through the aorta, and then from the aorta, our systemic circulation is comprised of the blood vessels that feed the upper part of the body and the lower part of the body, and then blood again continues back, now that it's deoxygenated, through veins that collect into the inferior and superior vena cava and dump back into the right atrium. The whole process starts all over again. And there it is in text form. Okay, last but not least, I want to quickly talk about the components of blood. We'll focus mostly on the red blood cells, but it's important to realize, because we've alluded to some of this before, that there are other things in blood besides simply the red blood cells. So if you were to take a tube of blood and leave it on, well, it's probably not a good idea to do this, but if you leave it on the counter in a test tube overnight, blood would actually sort of separate based mostly on density. In fact, probably a faster way of doing this is actually take that tube and put it into a centrifuge that would spin the blood, and all the heavier components of the blood go to the bottom, the lighter components stay up on the top. And if you did this, what you would find is two very distinct layers and one fairly small but still some usually visible component of the blood. And we'll talk about that in a second, but the two major components of the blood that you would see would be the blood plasma, and then which is basically the liquid part of blood. And then all of the cells, and mostly red blood cells, that are suspended. They're not dissolved, they're actually suspended in the blood plasma. So it's kind of like thinking about, we have water that's moving through our blood vessels, and there's a lot of things that are suspended. There actually are some things dissolved in the water as well. But remember, our red blood cells aren't dissolved, they're actually cells, so they're suspended in our blood as they circulate through the body. Our plasma makes up about 55% of the volume of our blood, and the plasma itself is about 90 or maybe more, 90% water with lots of different substances dissolved in it. So quickly, I wouldn't expect you to know. Look at all the things that are now actually dissolved. And I want to take you back to a unit we did way back at the beginning of the year on properties of water. And we talked about the fact that one of the interesting features of water is that it is the master solvent. Lots of things dissolve in the blood or in water. Blood is mostly water, so lots of things easily dissolve in the blood, and as a result, they're easy to circulate and move around the body. That's kind of a neat connection to something we learned earlier in the year. But look at all the things that are in our blood, all these different ions. Of course, ions are charged. They dissolve well in water. We have a whole bunch of other proteins that help with clotting and defense. And then, of course, importantly, things like the monomers that we've digested. All of our polymers down into monomers, they dissolve fairly easily in blood as well. So that's our blood plasma. But then the lower layer is actually comprised of a couple of different types of cells. The majority of that lower layer, the 45% or so, or 44% of the blood volume, which is the heavier, denser stuff, most of that is red blood cells or erythrocytes. And their main function, in fact, really their only function, is to transport oxygen, which is bound to hemoglobin. But interspersed in amongst the red blood cells are white blood cells. And remember, we talked about those in our last unit on the immune system. And so they have an important function in our defense. They are sort of the macrophages, which can consume pathogens. And remember, during the inflammatory response, we're actually trying to increase blood flow to an area of injury so that we can get those leukocytes or white blood cells in there. So, of course, those are also found in our blood. And just a quick note about red blood cells. Red blood cells are actually anucleated, which I think they're the only cells in the body which don't have a nucleus. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're the only cells that don't. The nucleus is essentially broken down or removed as the cells mature. And the reason is that these cells will never divide again once they're produced. They live about 120 days, only serving to do gas exchange. They don't ever go through mitosis. They're just regenerated by bone marrow. So they don't need a nucleus. And in fact, they don't really do any protein synthesis. They don't really do much of anything except shuttle. They're just shuttles. So they basically remove the nucleus to make room for even more hemoglobin molecules. Hemoglobin is the protein, or it's actually made up of 4 proteins bound together, which bind to oxygen and carbon dioxide. So red blood cells are basically these sort of big vessels packed full of hemoglobin molecules. And again, those are the major component of blood besides plasma. So they perform a really important function for gas exchange. It's really the only place that gas exchange is happening, at least in terms of delivering it to and from our cells. And a quick statistic here, we have in the human body, the adult body, about 20 to 30 trillion red blood cells constantly being replaced and broken down. And each red blood cell has about 280 million molecules of hemoglobin. So that's a lot of hemoglobin that we have in our body. That's how important that molecule is for gas exchange. Again, here are some of the cellular components of blood. That 45% or so is made up of a variety of different cells and cell types, including these sort of cellular fragments called platelets, which are important for blood clotting. I don't expect that you'll memorize these either. And there we go. That's the sort of overall summary of the components of your blood. So again, just to recap, you should be pretty familiar with the functions of the circulatory system. You should be able to identify the chambers and valves of the heart. You should know the pathway of blood through the body and where oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is found. And you should know the basic composition of blood. And next class, we'll be talking about the pulmonary system, which is the lungs. And you will hopefully see the connection between the circulatory and the pulmonary systems at that point.